You are listening to the Bat Flip Podcast, a baseball podcast from Belly Up Sports and the Belly Up Podcast Network. Here are your hosts, Damian and Matt.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Bat Flip Podcast. My name is Damian. I'm here with my co-host, Matt. Jam-packed week. We got, it was winter meetings week, so a lot of moves actually happened. We got a couple GM hires or president of baseball operations. A handful of good players actually being signed to deals, and a couple trades happening. And then we got a little rumor section about DJ LeMahieu and the New York Yankees. And then we're going to have our National League East Division breakdown today, which is going to be one of the more fascinating ones we have. But before we jump into all of that, what's going on, Matt?
Not too much. Just I've been all involved in football this week with my alma mater at Auburn firing the head coach, and I've been all involved in looking at the coaching search and following that, and also following all this baseball stuff. So it's been a pretty busy week sports wise for me, and we'll get into it here. I really am really excited for this one. So let's
Yeah,
go.
how about you guys just stay away from Mario Cristobal for a second, all right? I
We'll
know that
see.
one. And as being from California, I'll say it was pretty nice having my Colts beat the Raiders, because there's a lot of people around here that weren't too happy, and I made some money off that one with some
Hey, there
bets.
you go. There you go.
So,
That's what you like
but
to
uh,
see.
but yeah, so the first hiring we're going to talk about, I think it's really fascinating actually, because we've spent a lot of time these past couple weeks talking about which direction the Phillies are going. With maybe trading Zach Wheeler and maybe not being able to re-sign JT Realmuto and this big money loss. But then they go out and they hire a guy in Dave Dombrowski. So if you guys don't know Dave Dombrowski, he's been around the game for a long time. Been working in baseball since 1978. And everywhere he goes, he's pretty much built contending teams or winners. He started with the White Sox as a lower guy in the front office, and then worked up to an assistant general manager. Became the general manager of the front office player development. I'm sorry, with the Montreal Expos, and then he got his first GM job with the Marlins as they were an expansion team, and helped them win the World Series in '97. And worked with them through 2001, when he then became the general manager of the Detroit Tigers, and worked with them through 2015 and led them to 2 World Series appearances in 2006 and 2012. And then after the Tigers let him go, he ended up signing with the Red Sox and helped that team win the 2018 World Series. And then he took a year off after being let go of the Red Sox, and they were kind of hitting the reset button and everything. He was working on trying to get baseball back to Nashville. But him signing with the Phillies, it's a big thing because it sort of signals that they're a team that's not going to be rebuilding.
Yeah, this is an interesting hire for sure. I was a little surprised to hear that the Phillies had made this decision. Dave Dombrowski, he's a well-respected guy. He's been around a long time. I think a lot of people are split on him though, especially with what happened with the Red Sox. It seems like he caught a lot of flack for making some really, really, really bad signings there. Um, especially at the end of his tenure, that have set the Red Sox back, and honestly probably kept him from being able to re-sign Mookie Betts. Um, and so he was let go there. He's a guy who I think that Dave Dombrowski is a good. He's got strengths and weaknesses. I think he's good at putting pieces together for a team that wants to contend, but he's really not that great at being able to sustain a contender to keep it going. I think he's real aggressive, and he's the guy who will put all the chips in on the table. But we'll see what they end up doing. He's also a very old school guy. He's been around a long time. He's worked in a lot of different front offices, and you know, I think I don't know if he's the most analytically driven guy, and in this age, that is a little bit different. I think it'll be very interesting to see what the Phillies end up doing, and I think that you'll have to definitely wait and evaluate him after next year. I think is another thing to look at there, because I think with their money issues they've had in this past off season, you might not see him be able to do all that much this year, but maybe after next off season you might be able to see some changes in Philly.
Yeah, and that kind of goes along with what he was saying in his press conference, which is that he considers this more of a retooling of the club and not a full-on rebuild. He said there's too many good players in this club, and that that he feels they're a sleeping giant because they have the big market, they've got a good core of guys so already, and they have a good owner that is willing to spend money. He said it's not there's not endless amount of funds, but there's enough funds for him to make impact moves. But I wouldn't consider that to be so many impact moves this year. We'll talk a little bit more about what they need to do when we get into the division breakdown as they're on this week's episode. But definitely an interesting hire, and something that shocked me after what we've all heard from coming out of Philadelphia this off season so far.
Yeah, yeah, and I agree with you, and I think Dave Dombrowski, he's not a guy you make your GM if you're about to rebuild, because that's not his strengths as a GM. His strengths are putting together pieces that are gonna on a contending team that are gonna mesh well together, not rebuilding. Because everywhere he's left, the farm system was pretty barren and the money situation wasn't great. But they most places he's been had success while he was there too. So
Yeah, he
it's one of
gives
those
you a
types of
shot.
things. Yeah.
The next GM hire, I don't really know much about him. He's a guy who is only 41. He hasn't been around, as high profile as a name as some of these other candidates that we've heard. But Jared Porter got hired as the Mets general manager. He has won 3 World Series as part of front offices with the Red Sox and the Cubs. And then he joined Arizona as a senior vice president and assistant GM in 2017. And then he said today that they plan to bring more intelligent people into this organization and not just players. But he will be operating under Sandy Alderson, and that they even left the door open for maybe hiring a president of baseball operations in a year or two. Hint, hint, Theo Epstein. But it's not a guy that I know too much about, so not much that we can really talk on about his history in the game. But definitely, he's a guy with, from what his press conference said, he aligns with what Sandy Alderson and Steve Cohen have said, that they're going to build this thing right, and that they have funds that they need to spend, or not need to spend, but they have the funds to get any player they want to get. Um, but they're going to do it pretty smartly, and make sure that they aren't just going willy nilly and just going wild with it.
Yeah, Steve Cohen is definitely making a hire here, or Sandy Alderson. I don't know which made this specific decision that this isn't going to be a guy who calls all the shots. You know, and I agree with you. I think that there's probably a good chance they have someone with a president of baseball operations or a similar title to that. But I have heard, just through, rumors and Twitter and stuff, that it sounds like Jared Porter's a pretty well respected guy, and people do think he's a future, you know, shot caller, if you will, as a GM. I don't know if he's going to be the shot caller here, but maybe somewhere else, if he's there for a few years and the Mets have some success, other place might consider him for a president of baseball operations job, or a head of all the day to day interactions and or transactions. Pardon me, but yeah, I think it's a. I mean, I think it's a good hire. I don't think there's too much to look at here. I don't think that this hire is going to change all that much that's going on with the Mets. Because like you said, like we both said, he's not exactly the guy who's going to be calling the shots. That's going to be Sandy Alderson. I think Steve Cohen's going to have a lot of input in the situation, maybe a little bit similar to how Jerry Jones has all the input with the Cowboys. I think it's going to be a real active owner situation here, and I think he might really be number 3 down the list. So, but it sounds like a good hire to me for what it is. So, good for them, and congrats to both of those guys.
Yeah, yeah, especially Porter, like you said, that people have talked about him. He's been a candidate before, but not one of that many people have actually talked about. So him actually getting a job, and a high profile one, I would say the Mets are probably one of the most high profile jobs that you'd want in the game. especially under a new owner like Steve Cohen, who really wants to go for, World Series championships. So, but let's move on to our signings portion of the episode. And this one I found it kind of funny. Adam Eaton resigns with the, or not resigns, he signs with the Chicago White Sox on a 1 year, $7 million deal with a club option in 2022 for $8.5 million with $1 million buyout. It's a little funny because why I said resign is that the White Sox traded Adam Eaton back in 2016 to land Lucas Giolito, Rolando Lopez, and Dane Dunning from the Nationals. And now we've found out, you see that Lucas Giolito is their ace, their stud pitcher. Rolando Lopez is still a big part in that of that rotation in that team. And Dane Dunning, you'll see or hear in a little bit about why he is involved in this as well. Um, but it's solid signing for the White Sox. I didn't think that Eaton was the top guy that they probably should have gone after. Maybe a Jock Peterson or Kyle Schwarber, but Eaton plays his role very nicely, and he'll fit right into that team.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I think that Adam Eaton's a guy who, when the White Sox traded him, was an all-star caliber player. But he had dealt with some injury issues in Washington. He did get a World Series there, but I don't know how much of a part of them winning the World Series he was. He had a good 2019 season. He was worth over 2 wins above replacement. And had a 100. He was above average hitter in the league, 107 WRC plus. And 280 average, good on base guy. He always has been. A career on base of 360, and he's a good player. He could have been a guy who is he could have been a star player for a little while there. In fact, in 2016, his last year with the White Sox, he was close to being a star player because he was really, really good. He had almost 6 wins above replacement that year, which is a pretty elite number. But injuries have really hurt him, and he's going back to he's only 32. It sounds like a guy who's super super old, but he's only 32. Um, and I could see him, in 2019, he had a pretty good year. This year, kind of more of the same, a little bit injury riddled. Didn't have a good year this year, but I could see him, being a solid regular for the White Sox. And I think it's a good signing. You get him for a good price. He's obviously been there before, and knows the ballpark and knows the fans well. And you get a club option on him for next year if he does do really well. So I think it's a solid move for the White Sox.
Yeah, and he's also going to be a nice veteran in that clubhouse to go along with Jose Abreu. He's a guy who's won a World Series, like you said, with the Nationals, and has been in the league for a long time and just knows how to go about it. So, he can probably relate to, Eloy and Luis Robert a little bit more from the outfield perspective, and kind of teach them, maybe some ways of stuff he found, or, playing the ball off the wall and how balls play in that ballpark. But another signing, which has been rumored for a while, was James McCann finally got his deal with the New York Mets finished. We don't know the exact dollars on the deal. We do know it's a 4 year deal and it's going to be slightly over or around the $40 million range. But I think this is a big thing because most people were putting JT Realmuto, just to the Mets because they could spend all the money. But I think this kind of really sets them up to go, make a big splash in the outfield, maybe a George Springer, and maybe even a big starting pitcher like a Trevor Bauer. Or you can sacrifice and do, a Springer and a lower pitcher and then maybe a shortstop. But I think getting James McCann, he's 30 years old, but he's really started to come into his offensive self the past couple years with the Chicago White Sox. He could be a very sneaky sign for the New York Mets.
Yeah, I think he could be a solid player for them. He's a guy who he started off for his first 5 years in the big leagues with the Tigers, and I mean, he was okay. He was a backup catcher, and that that's kind of the way he should have been looked at from that time. With the White Sox, he's actually been pretty respectable. 2019 in 118 games, good power numbers. Hit 18 home runs in 118 games, solid, especially for a catcher. He had a really good season this year. Um, and with 7 home runs in 31 games, a 289 average, got on base well this year too with a 360 on base. He's a guy who I think is going to be a around league average to slightly above average hitter. I think he's a little bit below average as a defensive catcher, which is still a good value. I think this contract is. I think it's a good contract. This is a signing that he's only been worth in his entire career 3.7 wins above replacement. But if you do look at these last 2 years, he has been pretty good, especially for a catcher hitting the baseball. But that's not something he's done in his career before he got to the White Sox. So this is interesting. I don't think it's a signing that if he does, tank, go back to his ways, is at the plate that he had with the Tigers when he gets to New York. If he goes back to that, then I don't think it's an albatross of a contract or anything. I think it could end up being a little bit of an overpay if he doesn't continue what he did this year, which obviously with it being such a short season, maybe a little bit of a flash in the pan type thing. And last year he was, a pretty he was an average everyday regular last year. So I think it's a fine deal, and I think the Mets have addressed catcher, and that's something that they needed to address, and they've got a guy now. Um, I don't think this takes anything off the table for them. Um, you know, but it's a solid. I think it's a pretty solid move.
Yeah, very solid move. And theirs is a team who's struggled, finding a catcher that would be good defensively and hit. They had Travis d'Arnaud, and then they, went to Wilson Ramos, and then he even struggled. So then they brought in like Robinson Chirinos, and it's a team that's bounced around with catcher. But I think McCann's going to give them, a nice solid guy that's going to be back there, for upwards of 120 to 130 games most likely. Um, but The next signing we had was a guy who we actually talked about being non-tendered on last week's episode. Got a contract pretty quick, and that is David Dahl, outfielder now of the Texas Rangers. He is going to be 27 when the season starts next year. Signed for only a 1 year, $3 million deal for the Texas Rangers. But the interesting part is that he's under control for the next 3 years. So even though he was non-tendered, his arbitration still moves over to his new contract. And as we said last week with the Rangers, they had to find guys who were young or some talented guys that might be able to help them out. And as a guy who's going to start next season at 27, and we've said he's a solid major league player, could be a big sneaky signing for the Texas Rangers.
Yeah, this is exactly what the Rangers need to be doing, and David Dahl is a perfect fit for them. He's a guy who he's cheap right now because he has struggled, especially this past year. Um, he's a guy who he hasn't consistently stayed healthy at the big league level. Um, and he's a guy who, when he has been at the big league level, has had varied success. Not a very good defensive outfielder. Um, he doesn't make a ton of contact. He does have some pop, but I think when he does make contact, he's a guy who's able to hit for a high BABIP batting average on balls in play. I think he sprays the ball around the field, comes from the left. He's a lefty. Um, if he's able to stay healthy and is able to, work on his numbers, he's really an inexperienced player for somebody who's been in the big leagues since 2016. He's only got about uh, about 250 games under his belt, 264 games played, and about 1,000 plate appearances under his belt. So that's like a season and a half in plate appearances. So he's a guy who, if he doesn't work out, he's cheap, and you're not really hurting yourself with anything. If he does work out, then you have a guy who, is a former top prospect who could be a very good player. And if you're the Rangers, you need somebody who can go out there every day. And I think David Dahl's biggest thing is he needs somewhere where he can go out and play every day without a ton of pressure being put on him about being sent to the minor leagues or about, being out of the lineup, in and out of the lineup, being platooned, all that kind of thing. I mean, if he goes to Texas, he's going to play every day unless he performs just completely terribly. So I think it's perfect for both sides, and I like the move.
Yeah, I him signing for $3 million, it really made me scratch my head. I thought he was a guy who, I think in arbitration with the Rockies, he's only projected to get 2.5 million. So for the Rockies to lose a guy over potentially only like a $500,000 or something, that's a kind of a head scratcher. But it for him to sign with Texas for this contract, I think what it signals is that this was a team that's going to give him the playing time like you were talking about. Whereas he might have been able to find a contender that might have paid him a little bit more, but was going to be, either platoon or like a fourth outfielder type. Maybe if somebody goes down, then you're just like a super sub. Um, but good for him for going to Texas, and going somewhere that is going to give him a shot to potentially play every single day. Because he's a guy that needs that. With Colorado, he was always bounced around with the injuries and stuff. So,
Yeah, absolutely.
but
Another signing that we had, and this is just a really brief one. This actually happened, I believe, today, right?
yeah,
Greg Holland signed with Kansas City on a 1-year, $2.75 million deal, and that's not a gigantic deal, but he is a guy who had a really good year this year, even though it was in a pandemic-shortened season, and he only pitched in 28 innings. But he had a 191 ERA in those 28 innings, so it's a guy who definitely could have helped out a contender somewhere that's now off the market. So I just wanted to throw that out there as well, even though that's not really that big of a signing.
yeah, not that big. He should have been traded at last year's deadline, but wasn't.
Absolutely. So,
So maybe the Royals will trade him this year. Who knows?
yep.
Um, but from David Dahl to the Texas Rangers to the Texas Rangers making a trade that we've speculated on for uh, our entire history of this podcast, is Lance Lynn finally got traded from the Texas Rangers to the Chicago White Sox for Dane Dunning and Avery left-handed pitcher Avery Weems. That's kind of the tie-in of Dane Dunning, like we were talking about. So pretty much the White Sox got Lucas Giolito, Rolando Lopez, and Lance Lynn for Adam Eaton, and then just got Adam Eaton back. Like,
Yeah,
all right,
sorry about that. I
no, you're good.
kind of my mic got cut off for a second. Yeah, I really like the move. Really for both sides. I think at this point the Rangers got what they could get um for Lance Lynn. Dane Dunning's a pretty good prospect. Like we talked about, he came over from the Nationals in that Eaton trade. Um, the third big leaguer out of that Eaton trade. Um, so keep that in mind. But really, really, really good minor league numbers. Just about every stop he excelled in the minor leagues. Came up to the big leagues this year. He didn't pitch a ton. He pitched seven starts. Was decent. 3.97 ERA, 3.99 FIP. Which is the ERA predictor. So you would think that his ERAs that's about accurate for where he's at right now. Good good strikeout numbers. Not bad walk numbers. I think the walk numbers are kind of what's made him a good prospect. He's a guy who controls the ball really well, commands it in the zone, doesn't walk a ton of guys, doesn't throw super hard, but has pretty good breaking stuff and that command. So, and then also the Avery Weems is a kind of a flyer lefty uh, that had pretty good numbers in rookie ball last year. But the headliner here is definitely Dane Dunning and Lance Lynn. 2019 was excellent. Um, he broke out in a big way. Almost 7 wins above replacement as pitcher, 3.67 ERA, a Cy Young candidate really. And 2020, before the trade deadline, was very good. After the trade deadline, not quite as good. He ended up actually with a 4.20 FIP, which is pretty average. And even though his ERA was low, 84 innings this year, the Rangers should have traded him at the deadline, and I think we said that at the deadline too, didn't we?
Yeah,
Um,
we all scratched our head at that one.
yeah, and that was a really puzzling move. I think they probably could have gotten more for Lance Lynn at the deadline than they got in Dane Dunning, even though I think Dunning's potentially a solid big league pitcher. But I think that it's a good trade. I think it's a pretty even trade. You got a guy who's an established big leaguer who has shown in the last 2 years an ace level season. Um, for a guy who is probably a mid to back end of the rotation starter who will be consistent at the big league level and it has a pretty high floor, and a guy who, maybe that Weems ends up being something someday as maybe a reliever, maybe a starter, who knows. So I like it.
Yeah, it's a good trade. Like you said, Lance Lynn was very good, broke out last year, and then this season was very good until the trade deadline, where I think maybe it was a little bit of he was expecting to get traded or kind of wanted to get traded, and then that didn't happen. Maybe he just kind of didn't give it all those last couple starts that he had. Um, so he's a guy who's going to be he's going to be a solid guy. He'll probably be the number three in that rotation, I would say. Him and Keuchel will battle for that, but
I think he would be the number two above Keuchel at this point. Keuchel's still got some good stuff, but I think Keuchel will probably be the number three. This is exactly what the White Sox needed, though, was
yeah, it is.
another option in
Uh,
pitcher.
the only reason I say he'll be the three is because you go righty, lefty, righty.
Yeah, that makes
So,
sense too. But
but Dane Dunning, he's a guy who I actually really like. He doesn't give up a lot of home runs. Either that's one of his calling cards as well. And like you said, he was solid in his first year. I mean, he was an average pitcher this year, and he's somebody who hopefully over time, as he gets used to the major leagues, and not just in a shortened season. I mean, he only had 7 starts this year, only 34 innings. But maybe he's a guy who can potentially have a upside of maybe a number three starter. I think that'll be the kind of the ceiling he could reach, but that's still going to be a very good major league player.
yeah, hey,
Um,
you talk about him not giving up a ton of home runs. He's going to be pitching in that Rangers ballpark now, so that might be
mhm.
even more. He might give up no home runs now.
None. I mean, we saw that all through the playoffs that is a very hard ballpark unless you're the Los Angeles Dodgers to hit home runs in, I guess. But um, and like we said last week, Avery Weems is a guy who he can be, a lottery ticket for the Texas Rangers. Just a guy who has very good underlying numbers and very good numbers overall through the minor leagues, and maybe in a couple of years they can figure him out. I mean, he's strictly a starter right now, but even if that doesn't work out, you plug him in the bullpen and as a guy who, then you have a lefty reliever maybe. So very interesting trade and one that should have happened a while ago, but I think it's a perfect value for the Texas Rangers. It's a trade that you could say it's win-win for both sides, really. One side usually we always say, oh, this side got fleeced or this side lost, but this one I don't think you can say that.
Definitely think it's about right.
Speaking of a trade that you could say that one side clearly won and one side clearly lost, um, that is the Cincinnati Reds have traded star closer Rasiel Iglesias to the Los Angeles Angels for relief pitcher Noe Ramirez and a player to be named later or cash.
Yeah, this I don't like this trade for the Reds. I do like this trade for the Angels. Rasiel Iglesias is a very, very good reliever who I think the Reds have really undervalued the last couple years. Um, he had a fantastic season this year with a 2.74 ERA, but his peripheral numbers were even better than that. He's a guy who in the past has been really good. I think last year, 2019, wasn't fantastic, but he was still decent. But the rest of his career numbers are pretty good. And he's not he's fairly expensive. He's making about $8 million this year, but he's not that expensive. This is the last year on his contract, so he will be a free agent at the end of the year. But the Angels needed pitching in the worst way of all kinds, and this is a very good pitcher that they just got to be in their back end of their bullpen. And they really didn't give up much for him. I was a little surprised that. I mean, Noe Ramirez is. You look at his peripheral numbers, and they're pretty bad. He has had a couple good years ERA wise and with his classic traditional numbers. But his peripheral numbers are not very good. I think some of the analytics people like him a lot. Um, with his spin rates and his stuff wise, I think a lot of people like him. But he gives up a lot of home runs, and in the Great American Ballpark, you don't want to be a guy that gives up a lot of home runs because you're going to give up even more home runs. And he's it will be this is gonna it's gonna be a difficult. I think this is gonna turn out to not be the best trade for the Reds. Although I mean it's you know if you're not going to contend this year, which it looks like the Reds aren't trying to contend, then you might as well trade your closer that's got 1 year on his deal. And I think they probably could have gotten a little bit more for him though.
Yeah, you could have got a little bit more. And speaking into, how good Rasiel Iglesias is, this is a guy who has pretty much every stat you look at jumped in the better way this year. His home run rate that he had been giving up the last 3 seasons was 18.8, 16.7, this year to 5.3. His ground ball rate jumped from 38.5, 29.9 to 41.5. His home run per nine dropped to a minuscule. I mean, under one to 0.39. That's amazing. His walks, he dropped his walks to under 2 walks per nine for the first time in his career. His strikeout rate was the highest it's ever been in his career, albeit it is only 23 innings. But if you just look at the underlying numbers here, Rasiel Iglesias is a stud, and to give him up for Noe Ramirez, who is an average major league reliever, and even maybe on the side of not below average, and a player to be named later or Cash, which I'm guessing is probably going to be the Cash most likely. It's a stunning move, very very stunning to me.
Yeah.
I
You
don't
you
like
took
it
a
at all.
you took a team at the Reds that you were thinking would probably attempt to contend again after they kind of went all in on this past season, and they're not even. It looks to me like they're selling off veterans and trying to rebuild again. So, very disappointing for Reds fans. I think this is one of those trades that kind of is it's a tea leaf to they're not going to contend this year.
Yeah. So, a rumor that came out over the past couple days is that DJ LeMahieu and the New York Yankees are, very far off in which each person thinks the value is. About a difference of about $25 million right now between them. And what I found interesting is that pretty much it might be agent talk, but that the DJ LeMahieu is going to start considering other options, considering other teams, and allowed to start engaging with those other teams as well. Which kind of made it seem like, hey, I was trying to give the Yankees the first shot. I mean, we're over a month into free agency here, and we haven't found anything, and we're still this far off of value. So maybe I have to get another team involved, or maybe I have to think about taking my talents elsewhere. But it's a head scratching move if that is the reason for the Yankees, who seemingly are have the deep pockets that everyone thinks they have.
Yeah, this rumor came from somebody on Twitter. It was a reporter, an actual reporter off of Twitter that posted this. It wasn't just some random person. Um,
I
you
think it was
know,
Rosenthal.
it might have been Rosenthal. I don't remember which one, but it was one of the top reporters that was posting it. I do think this is probably agent talk. I think LeMahieu is probably going to resign with the Yankees, and that the he wants more money, and and he's basically telling the Yankees publicly, you know, I, I might he's trying to leverage for more money by saying I might go elsewhere. I'm going to check the interest out there. I do think he wants to go back to New York. Um, being off $25 million, that's a pretty good chunk of money. But I mean, I think the Yankees have that money. Now, the question I have about the Yankees is, what do they value out of LeMahieu? Do they think LeMahieu is a guy who's going to put up numbers uh, the Yankees believe LeMahieu is a guy who's going to put up the same numbers that he put up the last couple years somewhere else, where they don't think they could just replace him, with a guy who's kind of a similar style of player to him who will put up big numbers in Yankee Stadium? Or is it a case where the Yankees feel like he's a super talented player? Because I think there's a lot of reason to believe that DJ LeMahieu, while he was very good in Colorado, his skill set translates so well to Yankee Stadium that maybe he's a little bit overvalued based off of his numbers, his offensive numbers at least. Um, that, to where you might be overpaying a pretty good bit for him, where you could get someone else that could put up a pretty similar type of production to what DJ LeMahieu put up, or you could address another need with that money as well. So we'll see. I do think LeMahieu returns to the Yankees. I think he's a very good contact hitter, and I think a lot of teams would like to have him. So if he does go elsewhere, then there's a lot of teams I think will be very interested. So,
Definitely a lot of teams. And you've already heard some.
mm,
There's rumors that maybe the Dodgers, if Justin Turner doesn't resign, that they can look at him for a third base option as well. So, teams or agents maybe are pushing that out there pretty soon. So, wants to get that market developing. But I think that's all the moves we've had happen this week. So we can jump over to our NL East division breakdown now. Um, you know, Leading this division, making it to the championship series is the Atlanta Braves. They went 35-25 this year. And I'll really let you hit on this, Matt, because you're a guy who watches this team day in and day out.
Yeah, the Atlanta Braves had a good year. They did lose some guys: Adam Duvall, Tyler Flowers, Shane Green, Nick Markakis, Mark Melanson, and Darren O'Day are all they were good role players. A couple solid bullpen pieces who did well. Adam Duvall ended up being mostly an everyday player. Um, you got Tyler Flowers. Is kind of he was more of the backup catcher. Uh, but there is reason to believe the Braves might bring Tyler Flowers back on a 1-year deal. I wouldn't be surprised to see that. Um, but the big loss here for the Braves is Marcell Ozuna, who put up a gigantic season, won the Silver Slugger, and was pretty high up on. I think he finished sixth in MVP voting, so he was fairly high up in MVP voting. He was that good, and I believe he led the NL in home runs as well. So that's a big loss, and I think that kind of circles what they're going to need. Their core is as good as anybody's. Freddie Freeman, Ronald Acuna Jr., Ozzie Albies, Max Fried, Mike Soroka, Ian Anderson. You've got and Dansby Swanson as well, who's shown signs of turning into a pretty solid shortstop. Um, there's a lot of guys here who, it's a good balance of pitching and lineup. Um, you know, you've got a couple other guys even there in that lineup that are young and are potential stars. Christian Pache is a guy who played a lot in the NLCS when Adam Duvall got injured. That is a very high rated prospect that will probably end up being a starter in center field for the Braves. And you've got Austin Riley, who showed some flashes last year of turning the corner a little bit. We'll see what ends up happening. This is going to be year 3 for him in the big leagues. So, this is kind of the make it or break it year a little bit. But they've got as good a core as anybody. And I think the recipe for the Braves to be successful is very similar. They already added a veteran pitcher in Charlie Morton, who's a very good veteran pitcher. They already added a bullpen slash maybe a spot starter type, a swing guy, and Drew Smiley, who had a really good year last year, a veteran guy. I think the biggest thing the Braves are going to need to look at is that big bat. Year before last it was Josh Donaldson. This past year it was Marcell Ozuna. I think the formula is the same. You got a really good core. You add a veteran, solid hitter to that core, and somebody like maybe they bring back Marcell Ozuna to play left field. Maybe it's a Michael Brantley to play left field. Maybe they trade for Chris Bryant to play third base. It's one of those deals where I think you're looking at, they just need to add that one bat, that veteran bat, maybe a 1-year guy again, who to glue it together and add some depth to the lineup and go for it again. So I think the rotation is the best equipped it has been since the Braves have started this run where they've won 3 straight division titles. So I think they're in a good spot right now.
Yeah, and they can just continue to reuse or not reuse. They can continue to get that bullpen better. They lost quite a bit of pieces this year of guys who are very high leverage guys for them, guys who played a big role. They do still have Will Smith, Tyler Matzik, which are two guys that two big lefties for them. But like you said, they need to find that veteran bat. Are they going to bring excuse me? Are they going to bring Marcell Ozuna back on a bigger contract, or are they going to try and go kind of budget shopping, which they did the past couple years, and shoot for maybe a 1 or 2 year deal? Um, especially if this year, you're not going to have the added sense of an LDH this year. It's come out that that's most likely not going to be a thing where Marcell Ozuna was your primary DH this year. Actually won the award for the best DH in the National League. So, you got to you got to make a decision if that's going to be the guy you're going to commit to, and hopefully that the DH comes into the next year, or what. But definitely an interesting offseason, but a team that's not that far away from. I mean, we saw them push the Dodgers to the absolute limit. We're up what 3-1
Yeah.
in that series. So and should have won. Should have won a couple other games in
Yeah,
that
there's a
series
couple other
anyway.
games that could have gone either way that the Braves had some bad luck and were very close games. So it's definitely a team that this is one of the top. I'd say it's one of the top 5 World Series contenders as is,
Yeah,
and adding another piece, you could even consider them, right up there with the Yankees and Dodgers for next year.
absolutely. Well, next team in this division is a team that surprised us all. Actually, made the wild card, beat the Chicago Cubs, and that is the Miami Marlins at 31-29.
Yeah, the Marlins, they lost some few guys: Brad Boxberger, Matt Joyce, Brandon Kintzler, Jose Urena, who was their longest tenured player, as it stood. Their core revolves around their 3 big starting pitchers, the young guys. All 3 of them, or 2 of them being rookies this past year, and then one of them having been established for a couple years, but having kind of his breakout this past year. Sandy Alcantara, Pablo Lopez, Sixto Sanchez. All 3 of these guys have a lot of potential, and all 3 are pretty good starters already. You could add in a few of their our everyday players. Jorge Alfaro, guy they got in the Real Muto trade, the legendary Real Muto trade. That has been starting at catcher for them for a while. He's got some talent. He hadn't really put it all the way together yet, but he does have some talent. Brian Anderson is a very underrated player, in my opinion. Plays, playing in a few different positions for them. He's played third some. He's played right field some. Solid contact hitter. Can hit for some power. A lot of doubles power for him. And then they brought in Starling Marte mid season, and he's a guy who is a very talented player. Um, we can get into on the needs here in a second. I think the biggest one though is just pitching development. I mean, I think if you look at the Marlins, keep getting better. Alcantara, keep working with him, keep getting him better. Pablo Lopez, keep getting him better. Sixto Sanchez, keep working with him. The Marlins have some young guys who are going to be up pretty soon in the lineup as well. You got Monte Harrison, who actually played a pretty good bit this past year as a top 100 prospect. JJ Bleday is not all that far off. Um, a top pick out of Vanderbilt. He's I think he's very solid. So this is a team that I don't really expect them to contend next year. I think a lot of the reason that they were able to make the playoffs was because obviously the expanded playoffs had something to do with it, but the fact that it was a shortened season, they had some luck in there. A couple of the other NL East teams they were playing a lot really struggled at times. Um, I think Miami's, but I think they're in a much better place than they were just a couple years ago.
Oh, most definitely. And like you said, that they've built around that young pitching, and that young pitching is starting to come to the majors and have an impact. Um, another guy on the offensive side that is coming up pretty soon is Jesus Sanchez as well, who's another outfielder.
Oh yeah,
Um, I mean, this team is stacked with young talent all over the field that you just have to figure out, which ones are going to be the guys who are going to stick in the majors and which are going to be the guys who kind of falter out because that's the realistic thing here is that not every one of these guys is going to pan out, but you got to figure out who that's going to be and really attack the ones that don't. You attack that through either free agency or trade. You know, Middle infield could be another area where they look to really upgrade. I mean, you got Miguel Rojas at shortstop, and I don't even know who the second baseman is right now.
it
His name's
was with John Birdie
Birdie,
played
John
outfield more,
Birdie.
right? Yeah, he was pretty good this past
Um,
year.
Isan
So
Diaz as well is another
yep,
one.
he's a young guy.
Um,
Yeah.
but maybe that's a thing you do. But like you said, I don't see this team being a team that's going to make the playoffs this year. But I think they could be a sneaky team and contend for them. Especially if Alcantara, Lopez, Sixto Sanchez take that next step. If Brian Anderson keeps doing what he does, and maybe they find a couple pieces. Does Lewis Brinson finally figure it out? Or do they sign somebody? I've speculated that them maybe signing a shortstop. A guy like Andrelton Simmons would be huge in this place. Um, so team that's on the cusp, I think, of being a very serious contender in the next,
Yeah,
2 to 3 seasons.
And one other thing I want to add on the Marlins is I think this is a team who every year their record is going to look a little bit better than their team performs analytically and statistically. I think this is a team. I think they're a little bit similar to the Royals of a few years ago, back in with with the team that won the World Series with the Royals. I don't think they're as good as that team, but I think this is a team that style doesn't that of baseball doesn't seem to jump off the page when you look at different statistics like wins above replacement and WRC plus and all that kind of thing. But I think it's a way that I think it's one of those statistical breakers you might have. I think this is a team that's going to outperform a lot of the projections for them, at times because of the style that they play. So, good luck to them. I think they're in a pretty good spot for their future, at least.
Absolutely. So a team that we talked about a little bit earlier, that's going to be one of the most fascinating ones to watch this offseason is the Philadelphia Phillies. They were 28 and 32 this year. They've lost a lot of their big pieces. They've lost JT Realmuto so far, Didi Gregorius, Jay Bruce, Jake Arrieta, pretty much anyone out of that bullpen, but I don't know if that's too much of a loss considering how that bullpen really played this past season. But they have a solid core. I mean, you do have Bryce Harper, you have Reese Hoskins, you have Andrew McCutchen, Alec Boehm, who just came up this year. And then you got Aaron Nola, Spencer Howard, and if Zach Wheeler stays around, those are three solid pieces in your rotation as well. Um, you know, like this team, it's going to be interesting to see how they go. Are they gonna go for it this year, or is Dave Dombrowski gonna kind of do that rebuild or retool like he's saying, and you know, kind of step back from free agency so much this year, and maybe line that up for the next couple years. That big shortstop class is coming next year, and I think the next couple years free agency is a little bit better set for this one, or set than this free agency class is. And then they do have quite a bit of needs.
Yeah, the Phillies are a team that they used free agency to build this team. They didn't really build it the way that a lot of teams have been built recently, with through the draft, through international free agent signings, for minor leaguer type, for young guys, for prospects. They've built it through signing Bryce Harper and signing Zach Wheeler and trading for JT Realmuto a couple years ago, and those kinds of moves. Really, their homegrown talent, Andrew McCutchen as well, but really their homegrown talent has been Reese Hoskins and Aaron Nola. Um, until obviously in the future you look at maybe like Alec Boehm turns into a stud, which he looks like he might end up being a stud. He had a really good start. Um, this team, they have a lot of question marks. That they have those. They have really, really good pieces at the top end. Bryce Harper's still a really good player. It's not much more can be said about him. He's a all-star caliber player. Aaron Nola is a pitcher who is an all-star caliber pitcher. Zach Wheeler is not quite as good as Aaron Nola, but he's a very solid pitcher. I would consider him a solid number two. Um, they have these pieces that a lot of teams don't have. They have a lot of needs and to go along with it though, and they don't have, at least from what's been reported. Who knows if it's true or not? But from what's been reported and rumored, they don't have a lot of money to fill these needs at this point because they're big contracts they have. So you're looking at a team that you know Andrew McCutchen's contract is right now looking like a little bit of an albatross because of injuries. I still think Andrew McCutchen can be a useful player and a solid regular in the big leagues, but right now, you don't know is he going to be healthy? He's dealt with injuries since he's been there. You look at some other pieces. I just don't have a ton of belief in Scott Kingery. I think he had a really good year a couple years ago, but this year was just atrocious. What are you going to get out of him? Reese Hoskins is a pretty inconsistent player, even though he can go on stretches where he looks like a really, really solid, you know, uh, you know, hitter, an all-star caliber hitter, but he goes through stretches sometimes. Um, Alec Boehm, I think, is going to turn into a solid player, but it'll be interesting. Real Muto obviously being gone, if he's gone, they're going to have to, and they're going to have to figure out bullpen because that bullpen cost them this year. They were a pretty solid team this year. That bullpen cost them tons of games. It was probably possibly one of the worst bullpens I've ever seen, and they had no talent there. They don't have any talent returning there. They're going to have to sign a lot of guys and maybe make a couple big trades to shore up that part of their team because I don't know. I mean, they were bad in the bullpen.
Yeah, and one thing that also goes into that bullpen being so bad is that this was the worst defense in the history of Major League Baseball. Not just this season, the worst defense of this season. No, this was the worst defense in the history of the MLB. I watched this breakdown the other day of they were on MLB Network talking about it, and none of their players are very good defensively anyways, but their shifting was the worst that you can ever see. They were either not shifting enough, or they were shifting too much on a play. So they were never, they should have just went half of what they were doing if they were over shifting or just shifted just a little bit more. They always seemed to be, a step away from the ball on a play happening, or they made an errant throw because they weren't in the right position, and they're just trying to hurry it and stuff. So they really need to figure out what that defense is going to look like. They, like we said, they have lost Didi Gregorius, who at shortstop, he's not a great defender, um, but he usually makes up with that for his bat. But the outfield defense has not been great either. Bohm, they've said, has really struggled over there defensively at third. Is that going to be able to stick? At second you have Gene Segura, who also is a below average defender as well. So they really need to figure out that defense. That's going to help the starting pitching and the bullpen a little bit more. But that's the worst defense in Major League history is a big thing.
Yeah, this is a team, and that's a really really good point. And it's a team. If you look at the way they were constructed, they did not put a lot of effort into finding guys who are well-rounded players that played good defense. You look at Bryce Harper, his last year in Washington. Not to say I wouldn't have signed him because he's a great player, but just defense wise, he was terrible. And actually, I think he's been a little bit better with
Yeah.
the Phillies than he was in Washington, but he's still, I mean, a lot of it's tied into his arm. He's not a guy who's very good at, going out there and getting it. You
Well,
look at,
a lot of with the Harper thing is that they were
yeah,
playing him in center too.
yeah, and he's not a center fielder, so
Yeah.
that's a good point. But you look at other places though, Reese Hoskins, he really should be a DH wherever he's at. But obviously the NL is going back to not having a DH, so that hurts that a little bit. But he wasn't their DH this past year either. I think I don't even remember who it was this past year DHing for them most of the time, but
Probably Jay Bruce.
Jay Bruce maybe. But you know, Reese Hoskins is he was a disaster when they tried to play him in the outfield year before last, and he's a little bit better at first base, but he's not a great defender. I mean, you look at Alec Boehm. Alec Boehm's a guy who's kind of the same way. He's not, his natural position is, or his position coming up has been third base. He's probably going to end up being a first baseman. So because he's been really bad at third, and I don't know if he has the skills to stick there long term. And I think that's something that's been, a question mark for Alec Boehm throughout his prospect status. So this is a team that has a lot of question marks defensively. I'm 100% with you on that. And you got a guy, Scott Kingery is a guy who's been thrown into center field. He's naturally an infielder. They seem to have ignored that aspect of the game, other than catcher, where they had JT Realmuto, who is a very good defender, but JT Realmuto is not there anymore. So unless they re-sign him, so we'll see what happens here. They got a lot of question marks. They got a lot of things they need to change. They've also got a lot of competition because the next team we're talking about here, the Mets. I'll let you start off on them, but they're a team that's probably on the rise a little bit.
Yeah, I mean we've talked about them a lot already, and we'll dive a little bit deeper into them right now. But not a great season, 26 and 34 this year. They're actually getting a lot of pieces off this roster that was just hoarding money. Really, like Yoenis Cespedes was a guy whose contract took up a lot of money on that books, and he was often injured for them. Didn't play much. Jed Lowry, I don't think Jed Lowry's played one regular season game for the New York Mets during his contract, and he was signed what, two
Yeah,
years ago?
yeah. He, I
Um,
don't, I don't know if he might have played a couple games, but I don't know if he played any.
Maybe. They Robinson Cano has been suspended, so his contract's off the books this year, but that opens up a hole at second base. Um, you know, they've lost Justin Wilson, who is a solid bullpen piece, but they still have a good bullpen. Michael Walker, Rick Porcello, those are two big or not two big starters, but two starters that 8 innings for them last year. Wilson Ramos, who was their catcher, but we just talked. They got James McCann. This still is a team that has a really solid core, though. Jacob DeGrom, whatever you're going to get from Noah Syndergaard, who knows when he's coming back from his Tommy John. Michael Conforto, Pete Alonso, Jeff McNeil, those are three really good pieces on the offensive side of the ball. You can throw Marcus Stroman in here. I don't know how much of a core piece he is because he's only signed to the 1 year.
For this year, I would
But for
consider him
this
for
year,
sure. Yeah.
but for this year, he's absolutely a core piece, and he's a guy who dealt with injury this past season and then opted out. Um, so if you look at their needs, one would have been catcher. They've already handled that. Center fielder is a need that they've struggled with for years. So this just screams George Springer. Like, get George Springer here. He might not be a center fielder for much longer, but he can play center field for you the next couple years and be just fine at it. You can get another starter, maybe for some extra depth. I mean, you still do have Steven Matz and Seth Lugo who can use there, although we both think that Lugo's better in the bullpen than as a starter. Um, and then you have to figure out what you're going to do with that infield. Like I said, there's a hole at second base now. Do you slot Jeff McNeil in over there? We know Pete Alonso is going to be the first baseman. Is Ahmed Rosario going to be your shortstop? Is JD Davis going to be your starting third baseman? You still have, I think, it's Luis Guillermo.
Guillermo,
Is
yeah.
Guillermo is an option there.
I
Dom
forgot
Smith,
Andres Jimenez.
Andres Jimenez, that is another one I forgot. Dom Smith is a guy who should be playing first base and not outfield. But is he going to play over Nimmo and Conforto? And if you sign a Springer, so you have to figure out what you're going to do with all of these pieces. Definitely we've talked about this is a team who is trying to go for it this year. So maybe they look to kind of pawn one of those guys off, maybe. But it's going to be an interesting offseason for the New York Mets. Even more eventful than it already has been.
Yeah. Um, yeah, the Mets, I think if you look at them just from an offense pitching uh, perspective, I think they're going to be very good. You've got a ton of solid hitters on that team. And some guys that are potential star hitters. I know, Pete Alonso was a star hitter in his rookie year. Struggled a little bit more this year. But and the starting pitching health is going to be big for the Mets, and it has been for a long time. Degrom, he's been pretty durable. Does Degrom stay healthy this year? Hopefully, I think there's no reason to believe he won't. But um, you know, once you go past him, they haven't been durable at all. I mean, you look at Syndergaard, and he's missed a good part of the last couple years, and this last one being Tommy John. So is he going to come back? Is he going to come back with the same electric stuff he had before? Because I think he was mostly a stuff pitcher. He's a guy who was throwing 100-mile-an-hour sinkers as a starter and had a hammer curveball and a 95-mile-an-hour slider. This is a guy who was in the running for future best pitcher in baseball when he was fully healthy, but he might not be the same guy now. Marcus Stroman, what's he going to give you? Is he going to be healthy all year? Is he fully bought in? Plus behind that, I mean, you've got a couple guys like David Peterson and, maybe a Seth Lugo ends up in the rotation, like you talked about. What is he going to be? Um, so the rotation health is a big deal. They don't have a lot of depth there either. So if you do have a guy go down, you're kind of in trouble behind them. So as we talked about, maybe you do sign a starting pitcher. You know, uh, I would probably go more on the veteran side and use your money elsewhere for them. But maybe they're a team that wants to be a player for Trevor Bauer. We'll see. Um, Outfield, they probably could use an outfielder. I know Springer's been rumored there a lot. I don't know if Springer's a perfect fit. This is a team in the infield, like you say. I agree with that 100%. This is a team that I think is a little bit similar to Philly. I think they got more pieces than Philly does, so I think they're in a much better spot. But it's a little bit similar to Philly with that defense. I'm worried about that defense. You got a lot of players that are kind of just thrown into different positions that they're not very good at playing. You've got Pete Alonso is not a very good first baseman as a defensive player. He's a good hitter. Don't get me wrong. He's a good player. But as a defensive player, he's not great. J.D. Davis at third base isn't great. Jeff McNeil is got a couple places he can be kind of average at, but he's not a great second baseman. He's not a great left fielder. He's not a great right fielder. He's not a great third baseman. They're good at short with Rosario if he's the guy that's going to be there. You look in, but the alpha. I mean, you're going to want to get Dom Smith's bat in the lineup. He's not a good defender anywhere. I mean, are they going to trade him to an American League team? Maybe I don't know. Um, this is a team that they got a lot of pieces. Conforto's an average defender. Um, this is a team that's got a lot of good pieces, and on paper they're going to look great. Are they going to put it all together? I think that's the question for the Mets. Is their bullpen going to be consistent too? This past year, their bullpen was so inconsistent. They were awful at the start of the year. They got better. Some of their guys who are really, really good, talented relievers, like Edwin Diaz, were they struggled at the wrong times. They blew saves, even though they were good pitchers and had great numbers for the year. They struggled at the wrong times. The Mets need to put it together, and I think they're going to take steps in the right direction with the new regime there. I just don't know if it's going to be enough to overtake the Braves, but I think the Mets are definitely the second best team in this division, and I would say that them and the Braves will both be in the playoffs this year. I think the Mets would probably be the. I think if I had to pick, I'd say the Braves would be the champion of the East, and the Mets would be the wild card team. But that could change very quickly with the rumored players the Mets are looking at.
Yeah, I mean, this is like you said, it's a very, very good team. They're a team that can absolutely be a threat this season if they make the right moves. Um, especially with the backing of Steve Cohen now. But talking about a team that, fell from grace pretty fast is the 2019 World Series champions and 2020 worst team in the division. And that's the Washington Nationals at 26-34. They losing some key pieces this year as Drupal Cabrera was a starter for them. Sean Doolittle has been, an anchor in that bullpen for a while. We've already talked about Adam Eaton, what his loss means to them. Howie Kendrick was a big player in that 2019 postseason run and World Series. Anibal Sanchez was an innings eater starter for them. Kurt Suzuki, who's their starting catcher. Ryan Zimmerman, who's been a pillar for the Washington Nationals team for his entire career. Um, and obviously they lost Rendon last year, which is part of the reason why they're very far down this list now. But I, I mean, I don't want to say that this team is as bad as this because I mean they still have the pieces. I mean, you still have Max Scherzer, you still have, you know, Steven Strasburg, you have Patrick Corbin, you have Juan Soto, Trey Turner, Victor Robles. Like you still have a good solid core here that's balanced. Between your pitching is obviously a little bit more, you know, front loaded. Um, and that lineup needs a little bit of help, but I just have a hard time feeling that they're this bad of a team.
Yeah, and the Nationals, a lot of these guys that you talk about in their core, banged up this past year. Steven Strasburg being the big one. The worrisome thing about that going forward is that has been a problem for Steven Strasburg in his career. He's been injured a lot. He hasn't been able to stay healthy for long periods of time. These last couple years have been the longest stretch that he's been healthy. 2019, 2018, he was really, really good and he was healthy the whole time. But once again here in 2020, we're back to him, being in and out of the rotation. So you look at that, and I mean Scherzer, he's showing signs of aging a little bit. He's had those back issues the last couple of years. He hasn't been quite as good. I still like Scherzer a lot. I think he's still a very good pitcher. But is he the Cy Young level pitcher that he was? I don't think he quite is. I think he's still a really good pitcher. I'd still love to have him on my team, and I think he's a guy who his competitiveness and I think he's a great clubhouse leader. I think he brings that team together. Um, but Patrick Corbin took a step back this year. He wasn't quite as good as he had been in the past few years. But the big thing to me is that you've got two really, really, really good pieces in that lineup. You've got Juan Soto and you've got Trey Turner. Trey Turner hasn't been quite as consistently good since he came up as Soto. He's been really solid, but this year was kind of the best year he's had. A little bit that might have been short season aided, but he was really, really good regardless. And he's good play. He's been a good player ever since he's been, established in the big leagues. Juan Soto has been he's been one of the best hitters in baseball ever since he came up. He maybe leaves a tiny bit to be desired in the other facets of the game, but the fact that his bat is as good as it is makes up for all that. So he's a very, very good player. And you've got these two great pieces on offense. You've got these pitchers. The problem is that with the pitchers aging and maybe not being quite as effective, the Nationals are barren outside of these star players. They really don't have much there. You're looking at a team that, this past year was starting Howie Kendrick. They were starting as Drupal Cabrera. These are very, very aged veterans. Now, Howie Kendrick was a hero in their World Series run, but he's not a long-term solution, and obviously he's gone now. But they've been relying on a lot of very, very of aging guys to be their core the last few years, and I just don't know. I mean, if you get a full healthy seasons from Max Scherzer, Steven Strasburg, and Patrick Corbin, where they're all effective, you're also giving 40% of your starts to Eric Fede, Austin Voth, maybe Joe Ross if he's healthy. Like that's that's not great fallbacks there. I mean, those guys struggled this past year, and of course Joe Ross didn't pitch. I mean, if there's a reason to believe that you're not going to have Scherzer, Strasburg, and Patrick Corbin all healthy with their injury histories / age. So, you might end up having to rely on three pretty average starting pitchers or below average starting pitchers out there. Your lineup behind Turner and Soto is barren. I mean, there's really not much out there. Robles is a very good defensive player, but bat wise, he's not great. You look at at least as of right now. Now he could end up being really good, but you look at their other positions on the field. I mean, Keyboom has potential to be a good player, but he hadn't really showed it yet. You need a couple. I think you need a couple. I think you need a lot of lineup depth if you're the Nats, and then you also need depth in the pitching, and your bullpen hadn't been great. I don't think the Nationals. I think the Nationals need bullpen pieces too. This is a team that needs a whole lot of stuff to be back to a contending team. I don't expect them to be a contender this year. I do expect them to be a pesky team that wins a fair amount of games because of their stars, but I don't expect them to be. I would compare their team this year to maybe a little bit of like the Angels have been the last few years, where you have a couple of really big time star players, but you're not really that in it.
Yeah, I mean, I could see that. I mean, totally. It's hard for me to look back and see that, this team that has that, Max Scherzer, Steven Strasburg, and Patrick Corbin are not going to be, maybe that good. But you do make fantastic points. I mean, the depth is very, very, questioned, and the aging veterans part. I mean, look, Kurt Suzuki's been their starting catcher, and so is Jan Gomes. I mean, that's been their catching duo, and that's also an aging duo. They've held on to Ryan Zimmerman at first base for a long time, so it's starting to come to where they're going to have to, work those young pieces in, and they don't have many young pieces around that. So, I mean, you can't really trade Max Scherzer or Steven Strasburg or Patrick Corbin even to help with that, because
No.
I mean those would be your more valuable pieces. But this is just a team that's just going to have to stick it out for those until those deals are done, or until they can compete again. But
You got to look. You
yeah,
got to look. One more point there too is you got to look at Max Scherzer. This is the final year of his deal, so going forward past this year, you don't have Max Scherzer anymore either, unless he signs another deal with the Nationals.
interesting.
Um, that I think that the window is closed in Washington for the time being. I think that they have done a good enough job bringing in talent while they were in a World Series contending window and trading away a lot of pieces. They've done a good enough job bringing in talent to still be somewhat competitive and have potential to, if you hit on a few good players, be a playoff team. But at the same time, I mean, we were just talking a few minutes ago about the White Sox. The White Sox had, the Nationals had Lucas Giolito. The Washington Nationals had Dane Dunning, who would have been a pitcher that was coming up this year for them. They've traded away several bullpen arms. I mean, they traded away. Obviously, there was the situation with Felipe Vasquez. That's a bullpen arm they traded that ended up being really good until his we'll just call it legal issue. Um, then you had Blake Trinan. Blake Trinan was a national, and you know he got traded to the Athletics, and he's been a stud reliever outside of 1 year for them, and in this past year for the Dodgers he was very good. So this is a team that traded away a lot of pieces, and that's part of the penalty for going all in and going for it. They won the World Series, so the Nationals, all that's success for them because they won the World Series in 2019, but they needed to, they going for it has a penalty, and they're about to face those penalties now, I think.
Yeah, team that
So
met the harsh reality of
yeah,
trying to win a world or for going for
yeah,
World Series
yeah.
wins. But
But I mean, and it obviously, like I say, that they did a great job doing that because they won that World Series. If they didn't make those moves, they would not have won the World Series, but they won it.
well,
So
and it's very hard. I mean, this definitely has to be mentioned in this conversation that it's very hard for a team to still be successful when you lose two of your franchise's biggest players in free agency. Like to lose Bryce Harper and Anthony Rendon in back-to-back off seasons, that hurts.
oh
And
yeah,
those aren't guys that you're just going to be able to pluck some guy from
yeah,
free, another guy from free
yeah,
agency every year, or a guy from your
yeah.
minor league
Well,
system and plug into that lineup.
yeah, well, that's part
Um,
of the penalty that I'm talking about too, because they signed Max Scherzer to a giant contract. They signed Patrick Corbin to a giant contract. They re-signed to that big deal. So those are the penalty is that now they had a high payroll, but now that payroll's not you're not gonna be able to afford re-signing Bryce Harper. You're not gonna be able to afford re-signing Anthony Rendon. That's part of that penalty of going for it. You have the window of these players being in arbitration before they hit free agency, where you can either sign a lot of long-term contracts to players and go for it, or you can try to make trades and supplement what you have in a way that can or extend those players early and try to figure it out. So the Nationals won the World Series, so I would consider that core a success. But now it's getting to the point to where I don't know if I'm the Nationals. You look at the list of the NL East. I mean, is there a team in the NL East that you believe that they're better off suited future wise? I mean, this year maybe a couple of them, but in the next couple years, I mean, are the Nationals going to be better than the Braves? Probably not. The Phillies, maybe. The Mets, probably not. Miami, it depends on a lot of the young players, but Miami's got a lot of young talent. So, the Nats might be relegated to be in the bottom of this division here pretty soon if they don't figure something out.
well, I
So.
mean, they are the bottom of the division already.
Well, this past year was just weird though, because the Nationals were a
Yeah.
lot better than they finished this past year, and you know Miami was not near as good as they finished, and Philly was probably a little bit better than they finished. The Mets were probably a little bit better than they finished. So, I mean, it hurts when you're the Nationals. It hurts when you have to play in this division and you're playing teams that are good, and having to play the AL East too, which has had 3 playoff teams, and 2 of those teams being pretty elite teams. So um, that makes your record look a lot worse than it is. If they had a bunch of games against the NL Central or the AL Central or the AL West, then like they normally would have, then they would have won a lot more games than they did. All these teams would have, except the Braves, because they won a lot of games anyways. But
Well, we have rambled on for way too
yes,
long
we
already,
have.
so this is a very long episode. Sorry,
Hey,
everyone, that we
hey,
kept talking,
it's
but
important. There were a lot of moves this week. So
that's what happens with the winter meetings. But we
oh
went a
yeah.
little long on the division breakdown. We probably shouldn't have spent that much time. But, anyways, guys, thank you for tuning into this episode of the Bat Flip Podcast. And as always, if you guys have any feedback, just let us know, and we'll catch you guys next week.
Yep. Thanks everybody.